So we created our grid with 8 cells, and right now every child element of the container takes 1 cell. Now, it would be nice if we could overwrite that default positioning. And let's say element 3 should actually take the last 2 cells in the first row. So it should take the cell where element 4 is in 2. We can overwrite this by going to the child selector now. So L3 selects the element 3 here. And there, we can define where it should be positioned. We do this with the help of the grid column start property, for example. Do you remember that setting in the developer tools I showed you earlier? Display line numbers? CSS Grid actually thinks in lines. The grid is constructed by automatically adding a couple of lines before and after our columns and rows. So the first horizontal line here marks the beginning of the first row. The second one marks the end of the first row. And the third one marks the end of the last row. And the same for the columns. Now, if we want to tell element 3 to start at line number 3, well, then we can simply set grid column start to 3. This is line number 3, and the developer tools of Firefox help us identifying this number. Now, we of course want to also tell it where to end. And this is the interesting part now. Because by default, this is set to, well, simply span 1 cell. Now we can set this to end at line number 5. So column line number 5, which we simply do by typing a 5 here. If we now save that and reload, we see something interesting. Element number 4 jumps into a new row because its old place is taken by element number 3, which we clearly define to go into these 2 cells. Now, due to the helper lines and our preview at the bottom, you can still see that actually we got 2 cells here. But because of grid column start and end, we define that this element should take them both. We also see that if we hover over it here, it takes both. The same can be said for the rows. We can set grid row start to the row number it should start in. In our example, this would be 1. So let's set it to 1. Now, if we want to force the green element, element 3, to go all the way to the bottom here, so to the end of row number 2, then we have to set a grid row end property of 3. Because the last line here in the row category, so the last row line, is line number 3. With that, if we save that and we reload the page, now element 3 takes this full block of 4 cells, simply due to the way we configured it. And this is how you can explicitly position elements in the grid. Now, as you can see at element 1, 2, and 4, the grid automatically positions all child elements, and it starts filling the grid at the top left and then goes to the right and to the bottom, though it will respect the browser reading settings. So if you're watching this on a right to left device, it would actually start in the top right corner. It automatically fills that, but you can override that behavior by explicitly stating a position with the help of these properties just as you need it. This is something super important to understand, how you interact between your grid elements with the positioning and the grid container where you define the layout. This is happening in 2 different places. You define the layout in the container, you define the position on the child element.